Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 14 of the Beach Boys podcast. I'm Mike, and I am joined with my partners in crime, Nate and Brandon. How are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Fabulous.
So we have a little bit of an interesting episode tonight. We're going to be talking about Phil Spector with him passing away a few weeks back. And I feel like I need to say this up front. I know there's going to be some people who are angry with the fact that we're doing an episode on him. And, you know, Phil Spector is a very divisive figure amongst the musician community. And initially, when he passed away, you know, the thought had arose, you know, maybe we should do an episode about him. And I kind of just like forgot about it for a while. And then the more I thought about it, you know, I think that for a lot of us, you know, without Phil Spector, it is sort of debatable as to how Pet Sounds would have turned out. He was a big influence on that album. And I think for a lot of us, you know, Beach Boys fans, Pet Sounds is sort of like a gateway to the rest of the Beach Boys catalog and that entire just world of amazing music. So I think it is important to kind of, you know, at least understand who Phil Spector was, the good things and the terrible things that he did, obviously, and just understand where his place was in music and the sort of influences that he had on Brian Wilson, because it's kind of incontrovertible that Phil Spector was a massive influence on Brian Wilson. So just the more I thought about it, I thought, you know, why not? I mean, we could still, you know, discuss his legacy and the stuff that he did and the terrible things that he did obviously without condoning any of the bad things that he did. So that's my piece. I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that.
That's good.
That was perfect. I guess something that I want to add going in is I think since his criminal case arose, there has been a very one-dimensional view of him in the public opinion, that he is just straight up a monster and was only a bad person. So I think tonight, personally, as a Spector fan, wearing my Back to Mono pin, and obviously not to excuse any of the bad things he did, but I'd like to shed some light on Phil, the human, Phil, the genius musician, and I guess let's rock and roll. Let's get into it.
And I'd like to say that I'm going to be almost like one of the viewers for this episode, because I don't know too much about, I mean, my Phil knowledge kind of doesn't go beyond being an influence by Brian, the controversial stuff he did, and like Let It Be and All Things Must Pass is where it kind of ends. So this will be interesting.
And I would like to say one other thing too. Another big part of the reason why I wanted to do this episode is because, you know, we have Nate here, and Nate is one of these people, you've probably noticed this, that if he really likes somebody, I mean, he gets obsessed and he just knows everything about them inside and out. And I've seen that with him with the Beach Boys and the Beatles. And I always hear him talking about how Phil Spector is like his favorite producer and, you know, a huge influence on him musically. So it's kind of hard to pass up the opportunity to just be, you know, educated by, you know, a musical scholar like Nate. So another reason why I felt like, you know, if anybody has good access to good information, it's going to be Nate when it comes to stuff like this. So I'm excited to learn. I appreciate you doing this.
Appreciate that. I'll do my best.
So why don't you start us off? I mean, where do you want to start out from?
Let's see. Where do I want to start off from? Well, I guess to really understand the guy, you got to start from the beginning. So he grew up always feeling like an outcast. He was short, and two, he was Jewish during a very anti-Semitic time. You know, this would have been the 40s and 50s. So there was always that paranoia from even starting as a young child. And before I get to that, something that really had a huge effect on him for the rest of his life was that his father took his life when Phil was 9. And his tombstone read, "To know him is to love him," which will come up later. But So Phil had a real hard time in school, being bullied, and obviously with the death of his father, having to take care of his sister and help take care of his mom, it was very difficult. And the only solace he found is when he picked up the guitar and piano and discovered music. And for young Phil, it was jazz. It, it was classical music, particularly Wagner, who is famous for this huge dynamic sound, this powerful sound. And so that was what he found solace in through all the hardship. And so he was getting a guitar lesson, and I wish I could remember the name. I believe it's Jerry Cole, but it may be someone else. But he was getting a guitar lesson. And Phil was saying, just strumming the guitar in the lesson, I'm about to graduate. So how am I going to be able to make money with playing guitar? And Phil's teacher said, like, to be honest with you, there's very little money in guitar. Where the money is in writing, arranging, and producing. And with that, Phil Spector said, you're going to play in my session someday. And this guitarist would go on to be in the Wrecking Crew, and Phil kept to his word. And so he played on most of the famous Phil Spector hits. So with that in mind, Phil Spector put together a little group with himself, another backup singer, and a lead singer named Carol Connors, who would eventually go on to collaborate with Bruce Johnston and Terry Melcher on the Ripcords and Bruce and Terry hits. So oddly enough, she found her way into the Beach Boys circle. But anyway, so they put together a group, and Phil Spector told Carol, I'm going to write a song for your voice. Because from that early on, Phil hadn't even graduated yet. He was obsessed with finding voices and using those voices as like his expression for what he was feeling. So with all this pain in his heart and all this momentum, he wrote the famous song "To Know Him Is to Love Him," in tribute to his father. And so they record the song. It goes straight to the top of the charts, number one hit before Phil's even graduated high school.
Yeah.
So shortly after he graduates.
And real quick, this band was called the Teddy Bears, right?
Yeah, thank you. The Teddy Bears. The Teddy Bears, To Know Him Is to Love Him. Not only was Phil singing, but he was also writing, producing, and playing guitar and piano. So that was the only Teddy Bears known hit. But a funny story is that, so Phil had this huge hit. He sees it blowing up on the charts. He knows that he wrote, he sang, he played, he should be getting the money. And he hadn't gotten any money from the label yet. So he had to take up a job, I believe either at a secondhand clothes store or an auto repair shop, something real blue collar to make ends meet and to pay for his studio sessions and to keep helping his mom. And he got the offer to move to New York to work with Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who were the hottest writers and producers of their time, of the late 50s. So when Phil Spector was cleaning out his car, getting ready to move to New York, he found a check from the label for $1 million, or what today was $1 million. I don't remember exactly, but obviously an insane amount of money. So by the time he hadn't even entered his 20s yet, and he was rolling in the dough. So he moves to New York, and he becomes Jerry and Mike's like apprentice, so to speak. And he's doing like assistant engineering for them. He's doing arranging. He's doing playing on their sessions probably getting them coffee, whatever they needed. But eventually they realized what talent he had on his own, and he was allowed to take the reins for the first time. And some of his early hits after To Know Him Is to Love Him is Talk to Me, Talk to Me, which Brian later covered with the Beach Boys on 16 Big Ones.
Yeah.
I hadn't even known that was a Spector song until Brandon pointed that out to me.
Did I?
Yeah, so I appreciate you for that, Brandon.
Who was the artist that they recorded that song with?
Let me see. Jean Duchan. I may have said that wrong.
Never heard of him.
Yep. And then after that, huge hit that Spector wrote, reflecting on his like childhood and girls he had crushes on, Spanish Harlem, which went on to be a hit for Benny King, which he wrote and co-wrote and co-produced with Jerry Lieber. And off the tails of the success of Spanish Harlem, which was a smash hit around the world, that gave him the confidence and the capital to move back to LA and do his own thing. He was ready to be his own man and not just the right hand man.
What year are we at right now? 60?
Yeah, 1960. Okay. And yeah, you guys can stop me whenever you want. But
no, it's fine.
I'm just going to chime in with questions here and there. Just keep going.
Yeah, so we get to the early 60s, and of course, like I said, Carol Connors moved on. She's writing songs. At that, she's writing kind of early primitive surf songs with Bruce Johnston in them. So he's without her, and he's searching for new voices. And he comes upon a group called the Blossoms, and simultaneously a singer named Darlene Love. And infamously, he recorded them interchangeably and released them under different like band names, different artist names, to give the appearance of different bands. And it was like a marketing gimmick. And in his mind, he was the artist and they were just musicians, so he thought, I'm going to write the song, I'm going to pick the musicians, I'm going to pick the arranger, and then I'll pick the name for whoever this like band or artist is going to be. So he has huge hits with first like He's a Rebel with the Crystals, which the Blossoms were shocked to see that they had recorded this song, and it was with a lead vocal by Darlene Love, who, or it may not have been Darlene, I may be by Delilah Brooks, doesn't matter. They were shocked to see that He's a Rebel came out under a different group's name, and this began the long tension between Phil's singers and Phil, because Phil's singers felt like, we're singing, so we're the artist. We should be able to choose how we market ourselves, how XYZ. Mm-hmm. But, I already explained the way Phil saw it, that, he was writing the songs, he was picking the musicians, it was him. And part of that was Phil Spector always, I think, making up for the pain of, losing his father and being bullied in school. It created this hunger for respect and power and ego. So, in retrospect, you can say, oh, Phil Spector was just greedy and he just wanted the money from the records, and that's why he treated the artists like that. But I also think you have to look at how he felt as a human, and how disrespected he felt in his real life, and that the only way that he had any respect or that anyone paid attention to him was if he was Phil Spector, the whiz kid producer.
It's
So with that
interesting
aside,
too. Like,
mhm.
it's interesting what that led to as well, because
Mhm.
like I was saying, I don't know a ton about him, but the documentary that I watched about him said that he was really one of the first guys that made you think about who was actually producing a record. Like they said, prior to Phil, like the producer was kind of just like the guy that would move like 3 knobs and that was it. But
Yeah.
Phil kind of got you to start thinking about, all right, like who's producing the record, what does their production style sound like, and stuff like that. So it's like another example of, like, obviously we're not condoning any of the stuff that he did or how he treated his artists, but by doing some of the things that he did, it all of a sudden created this new sort of precedent for like knowing what a producer is and stuff like that.
I think he essentially, with at the same time, Jan Berry did as well. Jan from Jan and Dean actually used the musicians that were later called the Wrecking Crew a month before Phil Spector did. But anyway, Phil and Jan, but we're talking about Phil. Phil was the first producer that wasn't just a facilitator of the recording, but was, in his mind, a painter creating a painting. And everything was, he micromanaged the way the microphones were set up. He micromanaged the way that musicians played. He created the artist. He really invented what a modern day producer is. Before that, there wasn't really much of a distinction between a producer and an engineer. I guess the producer would handle finances, which is now like an executive producer. But Phil created what we now think of as the producer, you know, the Quincy Jones, the Max Martin. So yeah, that's a really great point. And so starting with,
I have two questions
yeah,
for
go
you
for
on
it.
that. Sorry. So one, at this point, so we were talking about the Crystals. Did he get the partnership with Philly's Records at that point?
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So yeah, he founded Phillies with Lester. Can't remember the last name, but we'll see it. I'll pull it up. Lester Still. So Phillies is a combination of Phil and Les. So yeah, so Phil was the youngest person in America at the time to have a record label. He was 21 years old when Phillies was founded. So
and he did that because of what you were saying about the money, right?
Yeah.
So when you said the thing about him with the $1 million, that was obviously after getting a partnership with Phillies, right?
That was prior. And that's what helped.
What really?
Yeah, that was prior, and it definitely, that's what helped him get the head start. But yeah, Lester Still was the like the businessman in the partnership, and Phil was the artist. So Lester was also putting up a lot of money. But also since how rich Phil was from having hit after hit, he was also putting up a lot of his own money as well. But it's interesting because pretty much with He's a Rebel, it begins an era where Phil was completely invincible. And everything he did was to huge success and critical acclaim. And in a way, he was untouchable. And by this point, he had the Crystals going, as well as a group called Bob Sox and the Blue Jeans, which were the Crystals / Blossoms, again, like mostly the same singers, with this guy who went by Bobby Sox. And they had a huge hit with an arrangement of Zippity Doo Dah, Zippity Day, the Disney song. And this was a real turning point for Phil, because he was constantly trying to achieve the Wagnerian huge sound, even from his first record, To Know Him Is to Love Him. and he hadn't quite figured out all of the ingredients yet. By He's a Rebel, he's figured out to use the echo chamber, and he's figured out to stack as many musicians in one room as possible, but it's still developing. And by Zippity Doodah, one of the other key ingredients of the wall of sound was discovered, and it was by mistake. So Phil was listening to a playback of the instrumental track for Zippity Doodah, and I'm not sure if it was by accident or by mistake, but for whatever reason, he muted the microphone that was picking up the guitar amp, that was miking the guitar amp, the electric guitar. And despite that microphone being muted, you could still hear this like ghostly like ambience of the electric guitar. And that inspired him so much and gave him so many ideas for unorthodox microphone technique, maybe not miking instruments and just picking up their ambience, or like recording it and then leaving just the ambience and just really using the studio as an instrument as opposed to just using it as a machine to record. So that was another huge development in the Wall of Sound, and it was a huge hit.
Which song was this?
Zippity Doodah.
Oh, okay.
And the writers of the original song wrote a letter to Phil after the song had been a hit, and congratulated him that it was the best recording of the song that they had ever heard. So
Zippity Doodah is like considered the first wall of sound, like the first full wall of sound recording of Phil Spector?
A lot of people point to that as the first. A lot of people point to He's a Rebel by the Crystals as a first. In my opinion, and as in John Lennon's opinion too, as he would later tell Phil, it was there from the very first song, To Know Him Was to Love Him. It was just him getting better at using the technology. But I think when you listen to Know Him Is to Love Him, the way that the voices and the guitar and the piano blend, it's almost indiscernible from each other. It's like a primitive wall of sound. Similar into a way that a song like Wendy by the Beach Boys is kind of like a primitive version of Pet Sounds with its like weird chords and stops and starts. Like To Know Him Is to Love Him was like an early wall of sound.
So just on the subject of the wall of sound, because I'm sure a lot of people listening know that that's like the main thing that Phil Spector is known for, is his wall of sound production. And Nate, you were just pointing out a couple of different traits of that. Why don't you tell us what exactly the wall of sound is?
Yeah. So the wall of sound, in my interpretation, I sort of feel licensed to say so because I'm really dedicating my life to try to bring it back into fashion the way that Brian and Phil Spector did in the 60s. So I think the wall of sound is having the musicians play and the instruments recorded and mixed in a way where you are just hearing the producer's vision and not, oh, that's a nice guitar part, or oh, that's a nice xylophone. You're just hearing a complete musical piece. And it's achieved through several things. First and foremost, you gotta have, it was as many instruments, as many musicians crammed into Gold Star Studio as Phil could get in there. And so you'd have maybe 2 or 3 Fender basses and an upright string bass, Dano 6-string bass. Then you'd have the keyboards, you'd have a grand piano, upright piano, Wurlitzer piano, probably a Hammond organ.
Hence Pet Sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then every kind of percussion instrument you could think of: shakers, tambourines, castanets, guitars, acoustic guitars, box guitars, electric guitars. And it was all about, in Phil's mind, if you could combine the sound of a piano and a harpsichord and a guitar, let's say, for example, and if you could blend those sounds well enough, it's its own instrument. And when you take that farther, when you blend the singers and the band and the echo and together, you are hearing a true musical vision instead of a band attempting to play what your producer's musical vision is. So I mentioned a huge second aspect of it. So you got to have the layers of instruments, and then you have the echo and reverb delay, which was achieved by, in that time, two means. One was recording the output of the mix into an echo chamber, which was like a concrete room with speakers and a microphone that would just capture the reverberation sound. And what most producers at the time overlooked, but Phil didn't, was how long you delayed the playback of the mix into the echo chamber. For example, if you delay the playback of the mix not at all, it'll sound like a very short reverb sound, which all the records at the time did. But what Phil realized is that if you delayed the reverb maybe anywhere between 50 to 150 milliseconds, it sounds like a cave. It had that huge sound. And he realized that he would record the instrumental track and then he would overdub upon it many times and then throw that all into the echo chamber and then blend those two, the echo and the original track, together so that the echo would, in a way, overpower the instrument slightly. So once again, you're just hearing music and not like a band. Another aspect which he eventually had to move on from was being in mono, because in Phil and Brian Wilson's mind, in mono you're hearing something through one speaker, so someone is definitely hearing it the way they intended. But with stereo, you could have your speakers right here, or you could have them right here, you could have them right here, and that would completely change the mix. So in their mind, the true artistic statement could only be in mono. Another aspect of the wall of sound, which is another aspect of the echo, which I forgot to touch on, was tape delay, where the way they achieved that was by literally recording the music to another tape machine and then playing it back slightly later, a few milliseconds later. So very primitive, but very like ingenious ways to make everything blend. Right. And like a final aspect was artistic use of compression. I'd say before Spector, well, let me first explain what a compressor is in the best way I can for people that wouldn't know. A compressor basically it does what it sounds like it does to an incoming audio signal. If you don't want it to go past a certain level, you can tell a compressor to push the sound down once it hits a certain level, and therefore how much you want it down, and so forth. It's basically to keep control of volume. And before Spector, it was used for just that, just to keep control of volume so that the needle wouldn't jump off the record, or so that nothing would overpower each other. But Phil used it in very unorthodox and very aggressive ways to make things blend. So there were a lot of ingredients going on to make this famous wall of sound that would go on to influence so many musicians: Brian Wilson, Amy Winehouse, George Harrison, ELO. The list goes on. And I could go on and on about the wall. I think I'll spend the rest of my life trying to figure out exactly how to get it and what the ingredients are. Another thing I should add is recording things and then speeding up or slowing down the tape to manipulate the way the instrument sounded. Phil did a lot of that too.
So I have two questions. Sorry, Brandon, do you want to say something?
No, you can go first, right?
Okay, I have two questions. So one, when you were talking about the instrumentation, like how would a piano sound if you combine it with, and whatever, like was Phil actually writing those individual parts in the music as well, like Brian did on Pet Sounds, or was there other writers?
Yeah, so Phil would have been doing that in the early days, but by the time of the era we're talking about, the early 60s, he had he essentially created a team for himself to be able to constantly make hits.
Just pump out.
Yeah, he had like his songwriters. There are names you'll probably recognize: Barry Mann, Cynthia Well, Carole King.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then as well as writers, he had this arranger named Jack Nitzsche, who did all of the Spector hits. So yeah, Phil wasn't writing those parts necessarily, but he definitely he wasn't writing. He wasn't like transcribing, but he would explain to Jack what he wanted in the arrangement. So I think he definitely was arranging through Jack's musical knowledge, and also Phil only had so much time.
And then the main inspiration for the Wall of Sound came from him just really liking the massive sound of Wagner.
I think so. I think that was probably the inspiration for it. That massive sound. I think he was trying to bring that into rock and roll where it hadn't existed before. And I think it was also, I don't want to say like a stroke of genius, but I really do think it was a sound that he heard in his head, sort of how Brian heard these amazing advanced harmonies. I think Phil really had this, for lack of a better term, like God-given vision. And it probably did come from Wagner, but I also think it came from wanting to prove himself as a man and not be the little kid anymore and be respected. And to be respected, he had to innovate and bring something new to the world. It's funny, he considered what he did as important as, in his words, like the Mona Lisa and the Wright brothers airplane. Like that's how important he saw what he was doing.
I'm going to throw something to you, Nate. I'm sure you'll disagree, but I've heard quite a few people say that in the span of a few years, maybe say by the time you get to 65, with like summer days, and maybe like today, summer days, Pet Sounds, kind of that span. I've heard quite a few people say that at that time, Brian had not only reached Spector's level, but he'd surpassed what Spector could do. Now, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think people who make that point just know the classic like "Do Ron Ron" and "You've Lost That Love and Feeling," which are pretty like aggressive and in your face the whole time. But there are a lot of songs in the Spector catalog that utilize like dynamics and harmonies the way that Brian did. I don't disagree with the fact that I don't think that Brian, I don't think artists necessarily surpass each other or do better than each other. I think each artist is as good as the other. We're all just trying. We're all musicians. So, I think Brian took what Phil did and made his own version of it. Similar to what he did in the early 60s with what Jan Berry was doing, and then he kind of made that his own. So yeah, I don't think it comes down to one being better than the other, but I do agree that Brian was better at making the wall of sound sensitive, maybe innocent. I think like Summer Days and Pet Sounds have that delicate, loving feeling. Well, it's funny I said that, but um, uh, yeah, like I think if you can say one thing about Spector, it's that he maybe wasn't capable of toning things down, and Brian was for the sake of like dynamics. But I think the argument that Spector couldn't tone things down is a weak one, considering Plastic Ono Band is very stripped. But yeah, I think I'm a huge fan of Brian, as you guys know. I think he totally took what Spector did and expanded on it in his own way. And I think what he did is just as brilliant. Like I don't think I couldn't say that Brian or Spector were better than one or the other. I think they're both geniuses.
So Brian would eventually go on to produce Pet Sounds in '66, heavily influenced by the Wall of Sound. So where we had left off with the Phil stuff, I think we were on 1962 or 63, the Crystals. So let's continue from there, and then we can see how it eventually all leads into, you know, the Pet Sounds and all of that stuff.
Yeah, so from this point on, Phil was working 8 days a week like a madman. He didn't really party or at this time drink alcohol. His entire waking hours were pretty much devoted to creating music. So he discovered this group of girls. I don't remember the name they were singing on, but they went on, you know, Veronica Bennett and her partners in crime, which went on to be the Ronettes. Spector was originally he commissioned his songwriters to either write the beginning structures of the songs, to which he would embellish or adjust, or he would write with them. So he had commissioned them to write this song called "Why Don't They Let Us Fall in Love," which he was recording with the Ronettes, which again, Beach Boys would go on to cover in the Keeping the Summer Alive era. But in the middle of working on that song, Jeff Barry and Ellie Greenwich, his writers, called him into the office where they were writing, and they said like, "Hey, we have the beginning of something and we want you to hear it." And they played the very, very, very beginning basic elements of Be My Baby. And Phil Spector with that said, I have gold, you know? And he stopped the Why Don't They Let Us Fall in Love session. He finished Be My Baby with his writers about Ronnie, because he had a huge crush on her. He was already in love. So
and he was married to, I don't think we touched on this, but he did a group called the Spectors 3, right? And he married the vocalist. He was married at that time to the vocalist from that group, right?
Yeah, right. It was a very insignificant group, but you're right. He was married, but he was completely head over heels with Ronnie. And you know, Be My Baby was for her. And so they get back to the studio, they record Be My Baby and smash it. You know, everyone knows that that song changed rock and roll. It changed the world. It's been covered a million times. Every pop artist has used that boom, boom,
yeah
boom.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the amount of songs you hear that have that like fill.
Yeah,
you know,
Don't Worry Baby, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's the time that I think Brian Wilson was really catching on to Phil Spector, because, you know, he heard that song on the radio, pulled over, and it blew his mind and obviously changed his life for the better and worse for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
But yeah,
yeah.
so,
For people that don't know that about Brian too, like when Brian went through that period where he just like stayed in his room for however long, didn't he go through like a period where he just listened to that song on repeat for like days, just like in the dark. Maybe not days, but like hours on end, right?
Yeah, not only that, but he also thought that Phil Spector bugged his house, and that
Yes.
Phil Spector was a quote mind gangster.
That is one Brian delusion that I don't think is that far fetched. The more you learn about Phil Spector, you know.
Honestly, I was kind of gonna say the same thing in it from a different angle. Like the way he portrayed himself, and I, as someone who's trying to create the wall of sound, I think I know how Brian felt. I mean, he was obviously losing his mind by that point.
Brian or Phil?
Brian, I guess, and
or both.
Phil. Both of them, yeah. But once you dive into the wall of sound and try to recreate it faithfully and try to study it, it'll fuck you up. It really does. Like, it is hard to figure out what instruments are being combined, who's singing, what intervals are being done. Like, there's so much going on, so much to be analyzed, that it can be really frustrating sometimes to try to dissect something so complicated. And I think that's probably how Brian was feeling, and then those feelings manifested in those paranoias. But yeah, so by this time, Brian was completely in awe of Phil. He wrote "Don't Worry, Baby" as a response to "Be My Baby," submitted it to Phil, and Phil didn't use it.
Wow. This was in '63.
It would have been late '63, early '64, because it went on Shutdown Volume 2.
Now, okay, the thing. Sorry, I was just
going to say.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say real quick, just the two big things that happened for him that year was "Be My Baby" and then he made that Christmas album.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I just
you also have, which we forgot to touch on, like "To Do Ron Ron," which I mentioned a little bit, but that was a huge
song.
hit.
Great song, "To Do Ron Ron."
Definitely the wall of sound in full force. And yeah, the Christmas album was, in Phil's words, like probably the hardest he ever worked on anything. Because in his mind, he got sick of hearing the same Nat King Cole Christmas standards every year, and he wanted to make something modern that everyone could relate to. And it's so amazing because with that album, there's so much going on in the production, like, and in the arrangement with like the sleigh bells and the harmonies and things that now we think of as like the Christmas sound really all originate from the Phil Spector Christmas album.
Wow.
Like before that, they were, big band or slow ballads, but like the signature Christmas sound, as we can all hear in our heads, really originates from Phil Spector's Christmas album. And at that point, he would work incredibly hard on singles and then kind of rush on the album tracks, or even commission other producers to do the album tracks. And he would just executive produce, because he thought that there was no market for albums until that Christmas album was like the turning point where he wanted to make a full statement.
So at that point, he did the album with the Ronettes after that?
Yeah. So, or this was all sort of also at the same time. Like a lot of it was simultaneous. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so he did the Ronettes album, which I think is definitely one of the best albums ever made.
I love it.
He put a lot of work into that album. He co-wrote all the songs, and again was not a collection of singles and throwaways, but a collection of where each song is incredible and could have been a single. And the wall of sound was continuing to blossom with strings and horns and just more unique percussion rhythms implemented from his like vast jazz knowledge. And Like you've got that Chapel of Love, which he wrote, and he had originally recorded it with Darlene Love.
He wrote Chapel of Love?
Or co-wrote.
That's the one that Going to the Chapel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, I never knew that he co-wrote that. That's
yeah. I knew there'd be Phil Spector songs that you knew, but you didn't know you knew.
I was like, wow.
So yeah, he did a real heavy like rock version with Darlene Love, and it was never released until the 90s. But then his initial version with the Ronettes has that that triplet castanets, which is so out there for, you know, first of all, like a non-Hispanic like pop rock song in 1963-4. And those things would obviously go on to influence Brian Wilson and you know, later like Jeff Lynne with using interesting percussion. And so the 60s go by, and he's pretty much, like I said, invincible. Whatever idea he
sorry,
has.
can I say one thing about that album?
Go for it.
Two things. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was reading about that Ronettes album is you see more and more similarities between Brian and Phil Spector in terms of just like the way that they work, because maybe it was the opening. They said it was the first song, so maybe it was Walking in the Rain, but they were saying that he made them record it like 42 times before.
Yeah.
And it sounds just like Brian on Pet Sounds. And by the way, that song, Walking in the Rain, that is like probably one of the first moments where I put on like a Phil Spector album. You hear that opening song and it just immediately reminds me of Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if it's a particular song, but just that vibe and like the sound, like the reverb, all the things that you're talking about with the wall of sound. But I really think like that album just encapsulates that, like the parallels between Pet Sounds so much.
Yeah, I'll keep it 100 with you. I've listened to Walking in the Rain and cried. Like just the way the 12 string and the reverb and the thunder and the harmonies and
the bells that come in the chorus.
Yeah. Oh. Right. Oh my God, what a sound. And to hear that and to think of like to hear that sound in his head, and then to go, okay, we need church bells, we need 12-string guitars, we need harpsichord.
Those little subtle things are what make the song for me.
Right, totally, and it's what makes him such a genius.
I'm gonna have to listen to this.
Oh yeah,
good.
I haven't heard
the
it.
Opening track of the Ronettes album. So, and then there's two other things that happened in '63 that I wanted to mention. One, I thought this was really interesting. He met the Beatles in 1963. I think they were the first person that they met in the United States was Phil Spector, and it was shortly after the JFK assassination. So the Beatles were like paranoid. They didn't know like how things would go in America. And Phil Spector was like the person that actually gave them the reassurance to come into America.
Yeah. And another thing that people don't know is during this early 60s period, he wrote Little by Little for the Rolling Stones and played on it as well, played the percussion. And he also wrote and played on Play with Fire, played bass on that. So yeah, he was huge in having the Beatles come to America, and he, like Brian Wilson and Jane Barry, who basically owned the West Coast, and they owned pop music, those three guys before the Beatles arrived. Brian, Phil Spector, and Jane Barry hit, and then the Beatles arrived, and everything changed. Yes. And they knew that, and it inspired competitiveness in all three. But Phil was the only person really at that time to really befriend them, which was probably in retrospect a strategic move when you think about Phil Spector as a businessman and as a person, to make friends with the competition. So yeah, the competition that the Beatles brought, and to the Rolling Stones and the whole British invasion, definitely inspired Phil and the Beatles Phil and the Beach Boys to kick it into high gear. So with this time, you've got Phil pumping out more hits like Then I Kissed Her, Sorry. Then he kissed me because we're doing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got the Beach Boys version stuck in my
I was
head.
gonna say, wait, is the Beach Boys cover that one?
Yeah. And of course, the Ronettes ones, "Be My Baby" and "Baby I Love You," "You Baby." Yeah. So the Beatles arrived, and he observes the changing tide of music, and that things were becoming more band oriented. So instead of finding musicians that he would create into a band, he began to change his mindset into finding established bands and then giving them his treatment. So were you gonna add something?
No, I'll let you finish first, and then I'll.
Yes. So his first attempt of that was and to much success was striking a deal with Moonglow Records to allow him to essentially like steal the Righteous Brothers from their label. I mean, not steal. He paid. There was a deal made so that he could start recording the Righteous Brothers, who were an established R&B group, kind of similar. They were basically playing black R&B. To much delight, I'll say this because this is a fun fact, to local veterans, most of which who were black, and they weren't the Righteous Brothers at this time, and the veterans would say, "Man, that's righteous," and then they started saying, "You're the Righteous Brothers," and so that's how the Righteous Brothers got their name. But so yeah, Phil changed his mindset. He was going to reach out to established bands, and he had this grandiose vision for what he could do with the Righteous Brothers, because he heard their voices. And again, he was always inspired by voices. He was always searching for voices, and was so inspired by the fact that they could go so low with Bill Medley doing the low baritone, and you got Bobby doing the tenor and soprano stuff. Both great rock and roll, soulful voices. So he commissioned Barry Mann and Cynthia Well to come up with "You've Lost That Love and Feeling," and they wrote the song expecting it to be another pop song, or at least like an R&B Righteous Brothers song. You never close your eyes anymore when, you know what I mean? And so Phil hears the song, and it's missing something to him. And he thought back to his early days as a teenager listening to rock and roll, and he remembered La Bampa, and he got the inspiration to have this ballad, and in the middle of a ballad insert essentially like what now we'd call like maybe like a sample, but in this case would have been like an homage. So you've got the chorus of "You Lost That Love and Feeling," you'd expect that to probably just go into another chorus and that'd be the end. But in his mind, to bring the song to the next level and make it an epic, in his words, he inserted that little La Bampa homage. It slowed down with the vibraphones and the bass and the string bass. That "baby, baby, I've got my na for you." That slowed down part, and raise it all up until it's this big crescendo into the final chorus, where he's using such aggressive compression and everything's hitting so hard, and the song goes on to become the most hit song of the 20th century. And like all like quantifiable metrics like radio play, use in movies, albums, CDs. In the 20th century, it was even higher, more played than Yesterday.
Yeah.
But finally, I think either Yesterday or Michelle finally took the top spot. But nonetheless,
This was in '65.
This was in December of '64, but like the hit happened in '65.
Okay.
And you have Just Once in My Life, of course, which is also And I think listening to them both, I think I actually prefer the Beach Boys version of Just Once in My Life.
Yeah,
I think, you know.
I constantly go back and forth because I love Brian's Wall of Sound just as much as I love Phil's. I think Phil's is obviously more epic.
More polished, yeah.
Yeah, and like of Wagnerian, to say that for the 1000th time, of like very cinematic quality, but I love the stripped, raw, almost depression of the Beach Boys version. Like
It's very
they really sound like they're reaching out to their girl, begging.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great point. And so then again with the Righteous Brothers, he has another hit with Unchained Melody, which was actually the B-side of a song called Hung on You. But for whatever reason, the DJs played Unchained Melody more. And so that goes on to be a relatively big hit and a huge #1 hit in 1990 when it was featured in the movie Ghost. So after that, Phil kind of started to lose interest in the Righteous Brothers. I think he felt like he had done all he could do with their voice. He had basically a bad habit of doing that with his artists. He'd have a bunch of hits with them, and then he'd kind of run out of ideas of what to do with their voice and sort of ditch him. Again, yeah, he was not the perfect person, and we can acknowledge the bad too.
One thing that I read about, or I'm sorry, not read, in the documentary that I watched, they were saying about the Righteous Brothers, which track was it? You've Lost That Love and Feeling. A lot of the people that they interviewed on the documentary were saying that they think that song is like the Wall of Sound in its like final, like in its completion. Would you agree with that?
I would say that's probably River Deep, Mountain High.
Okay.
But also I think You've Lost That Love and Feeling is as well. I think that Be My Baby also is. I think it's hard to point to one, but if you were to point to one as like the definitive Wall of Sound, I think You've Lost That Love and Feeling is definitely a great example of that.
I just want to, sorry, just back with the Christmas album. I just find it interesting that Phil does the Christmas album, and it's all it's classic Phil. It's big, it's epic, it's grand, and then Brian does his Christmas album, and it's very very stripped back in comparison.
Yeah.
The first half, at least, the non-covers, and it's kind of interesting that he wasn't inspired by that and went big as well with it.
Interesting point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess with Brian and his probably fear of Phil, I wonder if he felt like he couldn't do a better Christmas album.
Maybe.
It's so interesting that you say that too, because when we did the episode about the Christmas album, I think, Brandon, one of your critiques was that you didn't think it was produced very well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I just thought it was just a little bit too stripped back and basic sounding the originals. Yeah,
it sounds more like really Surfing Safari than.
Yeah, exactly.
And the albums
of that era. To think about though, because that was in '64, and then Phil's was a year before.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great point. After finishing up with the Righteous Brothers, after losing interest, he wanted to find another voice, and he found the voice that he claims that he had been looking for since he started recording, and that was Tina Turner. And he paid what today would have been millions of dollars to get Tina off her label and onto his, and to make an agreement with Ike, which I'm sure you guys probably know was very controlling, that he would not sing on any of the recordings that Phil produced for Ike and Tina Turner, and that he wouldn't play on them either. Imagine how much there's a word in Yiddish, chutzpah, but it's like, imagine the balls that Phil had to convince Ike Turner and this label to let him do it, but he did. And he swore on everything to them that this song that he had written, River Deep Mountain High, would be a #1 hit. It would change their careers. It would change the world. It was gonna be everything. He had the largest ensemble of musicians in one room that he at this point that he had put together. The backup singers included Brian Wilson, Mick Jagger.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah.
For the song or the album?
On the song. On the song.
It's off of an album of the same title, right?
Yes, and that's actually an interesting story too. So, Phil produces the single. He prepares the album tracks. As I mentioned earlier, for albums, he would commission other producers sometimes to finish the album track. So he actually commissioned Ike to produce some of the songs. He completed the album. He sent a preview of it to John Lennon and George Harrison, and they said that it was the best album they'd ever heard. They said it was perfect from start to finish. So Phil, again, making all these promises, releases River Deep Mountain High and prints millions of albums with the sticker that says perfect album start to finish, John Lennon and George Harrison of the Beatles. Releases River Deep, flops.
How is that possible?
So this is the interesting part.
That's insane.
This is the very interesting part. This is obviously just an opinion, and it's a pro Spector opinion, but you can sort of understand it, that there were two things fighting against River Deep. One, a lot of people did not like the idea of a white guy, let alone a Jewish white guy, producing black artists. And they would call it a sepia record, and they refused to play it. So that was fighting against him. Sepia,
what does that mean?
It's
like a black and white kind of.
Yeah, it's like the brown version of black and white, and like in an old movie where things look like a mix of white and brown. Yeah. Anyway, they wouldn't play it because they were racist assholes. And the other thing that, and this has never been proven, but it's speculatory based on, I had actually never heard it until I read like a authorized Phil Spector biography, in that the competing labels were getting kind of stressed out, kind of worried that Phil was so invincible. Like I've been saying, that everything he had done to this point was like a top 5 smash hit. Every artist he signed became stars. And they kind of thought, they worried that he was getting too powerful, and that he was taking up too much real estate on the charts, so to speak. That if he was constantly having top 10 hits, that there wasn't room in the top 10 for them. So there's an, I don't want to say a conspiracy, although that's maybe what it is. There's a school of thought that a coalition of labels paid off DJs not to play River Deep because they wanted to end Phil's reign of success, and so they could have the top of the charts. So for whatever the reason, it flops in the States, and Phil doesn't release the album because of how embarrassed he is. So in sort of like how Brian collapsed after Smile, Phil collapsed after River Deep and retreated into his house.
There's so many parallels. It's wild.
Yeah, for years. And something that's I love this story. So River Deep eventually goes to #1 in England. And Phil, being kind of the petty guy he is, takes out a full page ad in Time magazine in the States that says, Benedict Arnold was right. River Deep Mountain High, #1 in the UK. Which was, if you're familiar with Benedict Arnold, he was a traitor in the American Revolution. So that was basically Phil's way of saying, like, fuck you, America.
Yeah.
England knows music better. So this man really paid probably thousands of dollars just for a petty ad.
Oh, that's great.
And it's worth saying too, that he went into seclusion after this album didn't turn out well, and it's amazing because we're talking about all of this stuff that he's done throughout his life, and now he goes into seclusion. And at this point, when he went into seclusion, he was only 25, which is mind blowing.
He was
he had already done all of this stuff up to the point where he was 25.
Yeah, it's insane. He was had what became known infamously as the castle that he lived in, and he had hit after hit and all the things we talked about. And he was a kid, in the grand scheme of things. And so then you have a few years of kind of radio silence until the guys at A&M convince him to kind of get back into it. And Phil agreed because he found a new voice. And this time it was voices in a band like he was doing from now on. And it was a group called Sonny Charles and the Checkmates. And
what year is this?
This is we're 68 going into 69.
And also one other noteworthy event in 68 was that's when he married Veronica Bennett.
Yeah, very true.
And that off to a bad start. Apparently 3 months after their wedding, she already filed for divorce.
Yeah, and we should touch on now, he was, according to Ronnie and many others, obviously a very, very poor husband. In a similar way to Brian Wilson. I think Phil was much worse than Brian, but sort of mental illness overtaking the ability to be a good husband, especially probably the feeling of defeat that Brian and Phil had. Phil gets this deal with A&M, doing Sonny Charles and the Checkmates, and he has a big hit with this song called Black Pearl, which is basically like a song, like a pro-feminist, pro-black rights, like civil rights song, about like a black girl who's been in the shadows and now it's her time to shine. Like that's the idea of the song. Right. So it was a big hit, kind of given that it was in the civil rights era and things were getting better with that. So also marrying Ronnie, he told her that she would get a deal. And so she released a single on A&M that did absolutely nothing. It was you came, you saw, you conquered, and it went up the charts as soon as it went down. And basically with that, it was already one nail in her solo career coffin to this point. But Phil had success with Black Pearl and the Checkmates, but infamously, once again, once that success happened, sort of lost interest in their voices, and the A&M deal kind of fell apart. Just because with his mental state, I'm not sure he was quite able to, sort of similar to Brian during Smile, let's put it, like he wasn't able to complete projects on time. So one moment, I'm gonna get something to drink.
Yeah, me too. Okay. So where did we just leave off?
Sonny Charles. So yeah. So
69 or 68?
Yep. Yeah, about 69. So Spector.
He adopts a kid at that point too.
You're right. He adopts kids, and by some accounts was a great father, and by some accounts was a terrible father. So it's hard to really know.
The ones I saw were not positive. The interviews I saw with some of his sons, unfortunately.
Yeah. So if they're saying that, it's probably true that he was not a good father. Yeah, I've heard some pretty abusive things he may have done.
Oh, I didn't hear anything about that. I just heard that he was very neglectful.
Neglectful.
Pretty much like was just never there.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess that's kind of what I've heard too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Oh, I just meant like not physically abusive, maybe like mentally.
Yeah,
Obviously.
yeah, right.
I just thought,
yeah, not really a Murray Wilson as much as just like a absent father.
Right.
He did eventually change that around, but we'll get to that later. So he loses interest in the Checkmates because their other singles don't do anything, and he kind of goes back into seclusion. And at this point, there was probably nothing in the world that would have ended Phil Spector's seclusion, except for maybe two things. One would be Wagner asking him to be produced by Spector, and that obviously wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
But also, like, as a Jewish guy, the fixation with Wagner is bizarre.
So bizarre. So that obviously wasn't going to happen. And the second would be the Beatles asking him to produce. And lo and behold,
that might happen.
Yeah, lo and behold, he gets the call from John Lennon and Alan Klein, the manager at the time, with a cosign from George, asking Phil to do something. For those who don't know, the Beatles recorded an album in the early months of 1969 to be called Get Back, that was meant to be very stripped down, unproduced. Mm-hmm. And in John Lennon's and George Harrison, and also kind of my opinion, those tapes kind of sound like shit. And so they commissioned Phil Spector to do something with those tapes because they knew there was something there, which there obviously was. It's a great album. But at this point, John Lennon was playing in a way on Paul's songs where he was in a way, many people think, trying to sabotage them. Like he would play like out of key notes on the bass and just like weird things like that to piss Paul off. So Phil had a huge task in front of him, because you have these tapes of the Beatles, like uninterested, playing songs that no one really wants to play, not really playing their best, and he had to turn these tapes into something salvageable.
And the Beatles were really just like hanging on by a thread at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because the trip from India was kind of where it all started to fall apart, right?
Yeah, and they, at this point, were essentially broken up. They were all working on their solo albums, and they had all released, or not all, but most of them had released albums at this point, or in singles. So, but they just hadn't announced the breakup. But Phil knew that he was that he was working on the Beatles' Swan Song. So not only did he mix the songs in terms of like balancing levels, but for many of the songs, he like rearranged them by going through the rehearsal tapes, which there were like probably nearly hundreds of hours of rehearsal tapes, and he would find parts, let's say, where maybe he liked George's guitar playing better here, or he liked Don's bass playing better here, and like cut that out, insert that into the tapes. Like he was doing surgery on these songs, like ones that people don't even give him credit for, like Two of Us and like Dig a Pony and Get Back, like songs that don't necessarily have the wall of sound. He was really doing surgery on those tapes to make it sound appealing.
And then you've got the whole long and winding road debacle, you know.
Exactly. So as the album progresses, as his work progresses, this was over the course of a few weeks. It started with him turning the Beatles tapes into something salvageable, and then towards the end of it, it became Phil's way of producing, where it's his sound, his musicians, his ideas, and the Beatles were just his like puppets, so to speak.
Imagine
So-
treating the Beatles like that.
Exactly. So
Especially in
he
1970.
yeah, right. So he takes 4 songs. Very interestingly, he very surgically turned "I Me Mine," which was about a minute, into a 3-minute song by kind of in a good vibrations type of way, like cutting the tape and repeating certain parts and adding sections. Like in a way, he should have gotten a composer credit, I think, for that by deciding which sections would go where, so on and so forth. Anyway, so he overdubs members of the Wrecking Crew and orchestras and choirs on "I Me Mine," "Across the Universe," "Let It Be," and "The Long and Winding Road." To everyone's joy, everyone loved it except for Paul. Paul was very pissed. He sent a letter, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was like 1, turn the choir down. 1, remove the choir. 2, remove the orchestra. 3, bring back the Beatle instrumentation. 4, don't do this again. Signed, Paul McCartney.
Wow.
Phil's response was that if Paul thinks that or that Paul had no problem picking up the Grammy Award for "Let It Be," so he's got Phil mixed up with someone who gives a shit about his opinion. That was Phil's response.
God, the egos.
Mhm.
Jesus.
Two
Has
egos
Phil
clashing.
Spector, I've never heard Phil Spector talk. Has he done a lot of interviews?
Very, very, very few.
Really? Are there
A
any
lot of
like
that paranoia.
infamous ones that are worth watching?
Only there was a documentary made that was the only full-length interview he ever did, called "The Agony and Ecstasy of Phil Spector." I've seen it before. I was able to track it down, and then, like a dumbass, I deleted it. But I think I'll be able to track it down again, and I can.
Why is that so hard to find? Is there some sort of legal?
Yeah, basically, because of the fact that like there's all of the Phillies hits, Ronettes, Crystals, Righteous Brothers, Tina Turner, and then you've got all the Beatles music, and then you've got Leonard Cohen music, and you've got Ramones music, and it was just like a movie made by one guy. So I think that it would just be too expensive to license all those songs for him to be able to release the movie. So it was never commercially released, only played at film festivals, and of course has found its way onto the internet. The majority of it is available on YouTube, just the parts with the Beatle music is muted. So Paul was very unhappy with the way it sounded, because you can kind of understand how Paul felt with like the Beatles pretty much being replaced by an orchestra and the Wrecking Crew. And but it was a #1 hit, and it did fabulously, and John Lennon and George Harrison loved it enough to hire Phil for their following projects. First of which is, or I guess I'll talk about John Lennon's first. Phil and John had great success kind of recreating the Wall of Sound with Instant Karma, which was a big hit for John's first or second big solo hit. And then John asked Phil to produce the Plastic Ono Band, his first solo album. And I think John explained how raw he was feeling, what he was going through, and Phil understood that John wanted to basically use a trio of musicians: Ringo on drums, Klaus Vormann on bass, and John on piano or guitar, and then augmented by Phil Spector or Billy Preston sometimes on piano. So Phil, I think, produced the Wall of Sound, or produced Plastic Ono Band with a new type of Wall of Sound, where when you listen to the album, despite being so minimalistic, it sounds completely full. And I think Phil and John arranged and recorded this instrument so purposefully, so where the bass is hovering over the low notes, the drums hit where the piano isn't, and it was a purposefully stripped back wall of sound. And Phil would go on to produce a lot of John's solo albums, including a lot of John's most famous work, like Imagine and Oh Yoko and Happy Christmas, Power to the People, Stand By Me. The list goes on, and it was a little bit more, yeah, Isolation. So yeah, things got more tense with George when the All Things Must Pass sessions began, and they recorded this song called Wah Wah. And in the studio, it was a small group of musicians playing very dry, like this very groovy song. And little did George know that in another studio, Phil had all these layers of other musicians being recorded at the same time. And he was adding all of this echo, his famous echo, and printing it to the tape so that you couldn't go back and change it. So he came into the studio and heard it, and he was like, this sounds terrible. Like, what did you do? But he trusted Phil and decided to go along with Phil's production ideas. And to Phil's credit, the album was, and George obviously, but Phil's production instincts, I think, were correct because the album was a huge success. My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, Isn't It a Pity, all have that signature Spector layered sound. And that was an interesting time because Phil wasn't working at Gold Star anymore. He was recording in England at Abbey Road using their echo chamber. So eventually, due to just Phil was getting harder and harder to work with because by this time he had become known as the most famous producer in the world, invincible, genius, you know, the whiz kid. He wasn't even 30 yet, you know? And so he would start heavily drinking Manischewitz, which is the Jewish equivalent to the wine you drink at church. He would bring like a gallon jug of Manischewitz to the studio with a bendy straw and slurp through it. And so because of that, he was becoming harder to work with. But I'd say All Things Must Pass starts a new era of Spector's production, where he's working in stereo. He's no longer relying on reverb as much as he's relying on new types of effects like phasing and flanger. And so he produced a series of albums with this very hazy, psychedelic, warbly sound that kind of goes All Things Must Pass, Dion, Born to Be With You, Leonard Cohen, Death of a Ladies' Man, and John Lennon's Rock and Roll album. All had this very disorienting, over the top in a whole new kind of way, Spector sound. And when it was all said and done, Dion was very unhappy with the way that his album sounded. And he said that it sounded like funeral music. But Spector and Spector's fans took that term and sort of made it like into a positive. So that 70s era is referred to as Spector's funeral music era. And with his kind of mental illness in mind, not to like make fun of it or anything, but he was obsessed with death. He was obsessed with guns. He would oftentimes sleep in a coffin. He would show up to the studio in these crazy like robes and costumes, like heavily drinking. So obviously a mess as a person, but the music it created is so different than the 60s wall sound, and it's so out there. A huge hit he had in this era was Leonard Cohen's song Memories. Were you gonna say something, Brandon?
I was just going to say, with All Things Must Pass, I've heard quite a few quite a few complaints about the production
Yeah, from
on it.
yeah.
And I mean some songs sound fantastic on it, but I can here and there I can understand where the complaints are coming from, because George's vocals, they just get drowned
So
out,
buried. Yeah.
yeah.
Jeff Berry, Phil's co-writer, who did Be My Baby and all these hits, made the observation that by the 70s, Phil was going more and more down this hole where this isn't about George Harrison, this isn't about Leonard Cohen, it's about me. So I'm going to throw as much echo on. I'm going to do 10 drum kits and 40 acoustic guitars and, you know what I mean, and 30 saxophones, because this is about me. And it's, of course, it's all because it's this shy kid who lost his father, who got bullied in school, not to dismiss the bad things he did, but just to make him an understandable human, kind of in the way that we understand Brian. Phil never felt like people liked him for a lot of reasons. He was little, and it's a thing as old as time, in that little guys will get picked on. Anti-Semitism was, of course, getting, I don't want to say getting better, because was going down by the 60s and 70s, but still obviously not completely away. So he was always terribly embarrassed of being Jewish, and that was the beginning. A lot of his friends say of why he wore the wigs, and also why he went by the name Phil Spector. He was born Harvey Philip Spector, but he thought that Phil Spector sounded less Jewish than Harvey. But anyway, so it's this, you have this guy who really feels like no one appreciates him his whole life. So you can sort of understand the records becoming, drowning out the vocals, and from a human perspective, from a character
showcasing his stuff and not anybody else's,
And famously with Leonard Cohen, so they record all the backing tracks with Phil's, orchestra essentially. And then Phil has Leonard record what's called guide vocals, which are basically just something for the singer to have as a reference when they record their final vocals, because it takes a lot of time in the studio. But Phil heard the guide vocals and was adamant that it was perfect, and took the master tapes and mixed the entire thing by himself in his mansion, locking out Leonard Cohen. And he did the same thing with John Lennon's unfinished, in John Lennon's mind, rock and roll album, where he thought in his mind that it was good. The actual artist didn't know what they were talking about, and he was the only one in the world that could finish the albums. And he brought back his engineer, Larry Levine, for the Leonard Cohen album, which to Beach Boys fans, that name will sound familiar, because Levine pretty much recorded with Chuck Britz all of the Beach Boys' early 60s work. And when he finished Leonard Cohen's album, made up completely of Leonard's guide vocals, he wrote to Larry Levine on the master tapes in Magic Marker, "Larry, we've done better with a lot worse, and worse with a lot better." And Memories was a huge hit for Leonard Cohen. But again, he hated the huge wall of sound, because he was like a folk singer that wanted to do stripped down stuff.
What inspired that collaboration between him and Leonard Cohen?
Yeah, Leonard's manager, Leonard was struggling immensely commercially, to the point where it was causing financial problems. So Leonard's manager had the idea, well, if Leonard needs a hit, the only guy to go to is Phil Spector, obviously. And in a way it worked. And at first, Leonard and Phil got along great, just because they had a lot of things in common. They both had a love for early rock and roll. They were both Jewish, which gave them a bond. So they would drink, and they wrote the entire album together, Phil writing the music and Leonard writing the lyrics. Of course, by the time of the studio sessions, things became very contentious once Leonard realized that it wasn't his album at all, and that it was he was just being one of Phil's musicians, to the point where Phil held the gun to Leonard Cohen's throat because he wasn't singing the way Phil wanted.
Jesus
And Phil
Christ.
said, "Leonard, I love you." And Leonard Cohen said, "I sure hope you do." And Phil put the gun down and they went back to recording. But obviously, Phil was impossible to work with by this time.
There's no shortage of gun stories like that.
Right.
Yeah.
There was another incident that happened with John Lennon where they were
Mhm.
drinking, like you said, and it escalated, and then Phil pulled out a gun and he shot it into the ceiling.
Yeah, and the next day, John Lennon's roadie, Mal Evans, who he had brought back
Oh,
from
yeah,
the
Mal
Beatles
Evans,
days, said, "Hey, John, here's the bullet from yesterday." And John Lennon said, What the fuck are you talking about?" And he said, "The bullet that Phil shot into the ceiling." And John said, "What? I thought there were blanks this whole time." So
Jesus.
people thought that it was an image, but Phil, in his own words, really thought that no one respected him, and the only way he could get respect was if he had a gun.
Where did this obsession with guns, when did that start for Phil?
It started probably privately as soon as he had money, but publicly in the mid 70s. Probably not while he was working with the Beatles, but sort of towards the end of working with the Beatles. For that reason, John was done with him after he shot a hole in the studio.
Fair enough.
Yeah, exactly.
I just also with the just a side note with Ronnie, and her kind of failed attempt to have a solo career, really, in the early 70s, kind of thing.
Thank you for bringing up my favorite Phil Spector song.
Yeah, I'd like to just point out two songs, two George Harrison related songs with You and Try Some, Buy Some, which were originally, George had originally written for Ronnie, and then she tried them, and they were both going to be singles, and they just both weren't released. And then George is like, "Oh, well, I've got some nice backing tracks just sitting here, so I'll take Try Some, Buy Some and put it on Living in the Material World, and I'll take You and I'll put that on Extra Texture and make that the lead single." The thing I find interesting is that for both songs, George just took Ronnie's backing track. He didn't change them, like he didn't change the key that those backing tracks were in. He kept them the same, which is, you can tell on both of those songs he's really straining to hit those high notes that Ronnie can sometimes.
What I love, I guess it's tied with River Deep and a few others, but for me, Try Some, Buy Some is the epitome of Spector's wall of sound and the beauty that it can achieve. I think he kind of took some notes, which he'd never admit, from Brian Wilson and from Pet Sounds about making the wall more dynamic. But yeah, that song specifically has given me so much inspiration. And with You, a fun fact is that for technical reasons of the day, George couldn't erase Ronnie's vocal that she had recorded. He could only record over it. So there are a lot of parts on You, the song You, where you can actually pick out Ronnie's voice underneath George. So that's like a cool fun fact.
It's interesting with because obviously after All Things Must Pass, George didn't work with Phil again.
Yeah, ever again.
And Living in the Material World, George produced by himself.
Yeah.
And he did a really good job. Like, Living in the Material World sounds better than All Things Must Pass, really. I'd say production-wise. But in terms of how everything's mixed and how everything's balanced and stuff like that, you haven't got vocals that are hard to hear, and everything's really nice. And so George was a good producer in his own right. Yeah,
it's definitely a good like 70s soft rock dry sound for sure.
Yeah, lovely sounding.
It irks me that Phil Spector didn't get production credit on You.
Did he not?
No, he did on
Try Some, Buy Some. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Phil was probably George was so pissed at Phil that he was probably like, "Fuck this guy." But
So because you brought up Brian, I just wanted to
Mhm.
ask: are there any like stories of Brian and Phil having any interactions together?
So, and it's a crazy one. So Brian wrote a song for the Ronettes, and he got the chance to get together with Spector, and for two of them to sit at the piano. And you guys can probably picture how terrified Brian would have been of Spector as
Yes.
he explains. And he plays a song for Spector called "Don't Hurt My Little Sister." And Spector says, "This is a piece of shit. No one's gonna listen to this." Tears it apart and tells Brian Wilson to get the hell out. So Brian Wilson leaves terribly defeated that his idol dismissed his song, but Phil Spector took the crumpled up piece of paper that "Don't Hurt My Little Sister" was written on, that Brian Wilson threw in the trash, uncrumpled it up, and took the music and produced a hit for Jay and the Americans under a different name.
Oh, what an
using
asshole.
Brian's music.
He used the same chord changes.
Yep. And aspects of the melody.
Jesus Christ.
So again, really not a perfect human being at all.
No.
No,
not
Plenty
by a
of
long
examples. Yeah.
So with Leonard Cohen and Dion, in my opinion, they're some of the greatest albums ever made, but they were unsatisfied and they didn't do that well commercially. So Phil kind of goes back into recluse again. Until
I just want to. Sorry, just aside. I just want to say that with Don't Worry, with him rejecting Don't Worry Baby, and the Don't Hurt My Little Sister, you can so tell that it was just Phil being jealous of what Brian had come up with. That's all it was.
Are there
100%.
any? Is there any? Like, has Phil ever gone on record saying what he thought about Pet Sounds?
Yeah, he in the Agony and Ecstasy movie, he jokes that he wishes he had a nickel for every joint Brian Wilson smoked trying to figure out his sound. And he also says that Good Vibrations isn't a good song, it's simply an edit record. And he makes the like the allegory or a metaphor or whatever that what's the movie that Hitchcock did, the famous horror movie? Psycho. He says that Psycho is not a good movie, it's an edit film. He said Rebecca is a great film because it's a story and you don't need edits, but without edits, Psycho would not be a film, which is an interesting and good point. And that was the point he was trying to make about Good Vibrations, which I think we can all disagree with. Good Vibrations is an incredible song. Yeah. But he ended that little Brian Wilson rant off with, "But I love the guy." So
well, are you sure?
Yeah, so who the hell he reminds me of he has that, and people in the comments, don't make this political. He definitely has that Donald Trump and also kind of Mike Love like ego going. Yeah. Where he could say something like that and like then end Trump it with say, "But I love the guy."
Yeah, but I love him. He's a great guy.
Yeah, literally.
I mean, it would be nice if the respect was kind of mutual. Both ways, you know.
Yeah, and if Phil says that he loves the guy, if in one time he could have thrown Brian Wilson a bone. Brian Wilson, during the Christmas sessions, came to the studio to play piano on a song, and
Phil said it was bad. Yeah.
Which, I mean, on one hand, Brian wasn't necessarily much of a competent piano player compared to the Wrecking Crew guys, but was also good enough to play alongside on them on so many songs. So it was probably an ego thing.
Yeah.
But then again, I guess one positive interaction is, I don't think there's any proof of this, but the legend is that Phil recruited Mick Jagger and Brian Wilson for River Deep Mountain High in the chorus of backup singers. Although I don't think Brian's ever confirmed that.
I'm sorry. Didn't Phil like do something with Harry Nilsson that was like a tribute to Brian Wilson?
Yeah, so that's another connection. Harry Nilsson wrote a song in tribute to Brian Wilson's writing style called "This Could Be the
This could be
Night,"
the night. Yep.
which is a classic song. I'll do a little plug. I covered it and named my album I released "This Could Be the Night" after it.
Beautiful.
Send me the link. I'll put the link in the
Oh
comments.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really, really beautiful song, and I bet you $1,000,000 Phil wouldn't have recorded it if he knew it was a Brian tribute.
Mm.
It's under
Yeah,
with
so-
Modern Folk Quartet. Is the name of the group?
Exactly. Yeah.
And on the comp, for what's it? Everybody sings Nilsson, or for the
Mhm.
love of what's it called? For the love of Nilsson, or everybody sings.
Oh yeah,
Nilsson or
Brian
something.
Wilson covers it.
Yeah, Brian covers it. Yeah. So
Yeah, and then Spector also produced a duet of Cher and Harry Nilsson doing "A Love Like Yours Don't Come Knocking," which was he originally did with Tina Turner. So yeah, so he's back into Recluse until after Dion and Leonard Cohen and John Lennon's rock and roll doesn't go well for personal reasons with him and the artists, and then he finally finds his band, his final band. He feels in his heart that this might be his swan song because he was becoming aware in a way of how people were perceiving him. And coincidentally, at this time, the Ramones, which were the group was, they were trying to create something more commercial. So they get together with Spector, and famously, they'd record albums in a day, and this took them a month to record, which by Spector's work patterns was very short, but for the Ramones, it was very long, and so it was very heated, very tense. The Wrecking Crew was playing most of the instruments. Phil was only focused on the singer. But with all that said,
alleged stories of him pulling a gun on
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
it was the drummer, right? Dee Dee.
Yeah,
Right.
alleged stories of him holding all of them at gunpoint in his mansion and listening to them, making them listen to him play "Be My Baby" on piano all night.
At gunpoint.
At gunpoint, as he sang "Be My Baby" over and over and over and over and over and over.
I mean, look, after the early 70s, after like the Let It Be and All Things Must Pass stuff, why in your right mind would you get Phil to produce something for you after all that? Like that's, I mean, I know Phil Spector's Phil Spector, but would you really want to put up with all that? Like, seriously?
I mean, yeah, I think
some people are up for a weird time. Some people want an adventure. You know?
I guess
people saw the track record. They're like, well, if he's good enough for the Beatles, and
Yeah.
you know, like
Well,
all the
I'm
stuff
sure,
he was
you
doing
know,
with them did really well. And then they only
sure.
discovered once it happened what a pain in the ass he was. But
Such
yeah,
a household name at that point too, though. I would
True,
imagine if
yeah.
you did an album just putting Phil Spector's name on it, it's got to be worth something.
Yeah, that was what these artists thought too, and that's why they were willing to put up with him to some extent. So the Ramones album does very well, and Phil Spector spent like a year mixing it, and spent like millions of dollars mixing it. A punk album, like
What is this? 81.
this is like 79 going into 1980.
Oh,
okay. Finally, and this was because he was kind of aware that this may be his swan song, and he wanted it to be perfect. And the album did well. The Ramones achieved what they wanted in commercial attention. And Phil,
musically,
again,
like, was it a lot different than the other Ramones stuff?
Some songs are definitely very different. Like they have full on Wrecking Crew orchestra. Like they sound like they could have been like 60s Spector songs. And then some of them are just like straight up Ramones songs with just that Spector perfect mixing.
Because that was definitely a collaboration I wasn't aware of at all. I'm definitely intrigued at what a Phil Spector Ramones album sounds like. I got to check that out.
It's pretty. The production is pretty brilliant. He kind of in a similar way as Plastic Ono Band I think those were like the two times where he wasn't trying to make it super obvious that he was producing and sort of let the band speak for themselves. Even though he was replacing the actual band in the case of the Ramones on many of the tracks. But at this point, with him realizing that his career may have been kind of wrapping up, he starts to attempt to turn his life around, and then John Lennon is shot. And they were very good friends for a while until Phil became too hard to work with. So imagine how Phil felt never being able to make amends with John and then losing what he felt was like his best friend, like one of his only friends he ever made. So he spirals back into the worst alcoholism of his life thus far, and his radio silence on his end until Yoko brings him in to produce. He swore that the Ramones would be his swan song, but Yoko asked him to produce her solo album in tribute of John. So Phil agreed to do that, and but was so screwed up over John's death that he was impossible to work with because of how emotional he was, that he left the project because he couldn't do it. It was making him too upset. And so the Ramones would have been his final work until Celine Dion's people wanted him to produce an album for her. And it started off going well until they realized that Phil wasn't producing a Celine Dion album. He was producing a Phil Spector album with Celine singing. And so they split ways, and it was very contentious. And one night, after a very loud fight in the studio, the press shows up, and Phil Spector says to the press, "You don't," and I'm paraphrasing, but you don't tell Albert Einstein how to think, you don't tell Malcolm X how to speak, and you don't tell Phil Spector how to produce. So he blew it with Celine Dion. There's a recording of Celine Dion doing River Deep Mountain High, as well as other songs that Phil Spector had written for her. But she will never let them be released because of how angry she was with him after the sessions. So Phil, after that, finally decides that it's time to turn his life around and to give up drinking and to start seeing a psychologist, start
Was
eating
this
better.
in the 90s or the 80s?
Yeah, 90s.
And then so one noteworthy thing is in 89, he got inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first times that anybody had really seen him out in public, right? Pretty much
Yeah.
the entirety of the 80s.
Exactly. I can't believe I missed that. But yeah, and it was definitely people. It, in a way, because of him wearing the toupee, it just continued the myth of him being the toupee wearing freak. Instead of like someone who deserved why he was being nominated or why, you know what I mean? Like instead of focusing on the music, people were focusing on how weird he looked that night. But anyway, so by the 90s, he finally decides that maybe it's time to stop playing with guns less and stop drinking and make amends with his children. And by the accounts of all that were close to him, that's exactly what he did. And he was finally speaking to his children again, and he was taking actual psychological medication, not just alcohol to cover up the pain, but actual proper medication.
Did he do drugs as well?
He says that he never did, but there's a lot of accounts of him taking pills during the Let It Be sessions.
He never had like a psychedelic phase like Brian did?
No. He was pretty terrified of drugs. I'm not sure why, but there are accounts of him taking pills during the Beatles sessions, but other than that, it was pretty much just alcohol. But he had cleaned up and was taking like properly diagnosed medicine.
He had
And
twins,
it
right?
seemed, yep, and it seemed like finally things were stable. He had produced some new songs that he had co-written for a British group called Star Sailor. And then the Beatles people release Let It Be Naked, which
Mhm.
was a CD of Let It Be stripped of all of Phil Spector's production and, in his mind, hard work. And that was enough to uh, make him fall back into the alcohol and the guns. And of
What year
course,
was
this
this?
was 2003.
Yeah.
And also, we know what happens in 2003. So you can't blame it on the Beatles, because this man obviously had a problem with guns and a problem with alcohol. But it's interesting that he had finally turned his life around, and then an album comes out where, in his self-conscious mind, was saying like, fuck you, screw you, your work was terrible.
Right.
Let It Be Naked was getting huge praise from the critics, and he felt like completely disrespected and fell back into his bad habits of drinking and guns. And we all know how that night ended.
Yeah, so why don't
There,
you take everybody through the entire thing, because maybe
okay.
some people aren't aware of what actually happened, but this story right here is kind of like the main thing that has defined Phil Spector's legacy. Unfortunately, why don't you take us through the
Yeah.
whole thing, Nate?
So, okay, I people will probably know that I have a little bit of a prospector bias, but I'm also willing to acknowledge that he very well may have killed this woman. It probably killed her. But um, Let It Be Naked comes out. He's back to drinking like a maniac, and he one night shows up at the House of Blues, where a struggling actress named Lana Clarkson was working. And over the course of the night, they kind of schmooze it up, and Lana agrees to come back to Phil's house. And no one really knows what happened in the hours that they were together in the house. There's forensic evidence that they had intercourse. Um, there was some evidence that some kind of altercation took place. But again, it was two people alone in a house, and by the end of the night, Lana Clarkson had passed away from a bullet wound in her mouth. Now, at this point, Phil Spector, very drunk, very probably confused and scared, obviously, walks out to his driver and says, "I think I killed somebody," which to most people, including the judges of the eventual, conviction, that's enough to say that he killed her. I think I killed someone is kind of an admission. But at the same time, Phil had many guns registered to him. Everyone knows how many guns he had, but that gun was not registered to him, and the gun did not have his fingerprints on it. Also, the Phil Spector's lawyer's argument, based on scientific evidence, was that the way the bullet entered her mouth could not have been from someone standing where they say Spector was standing. It would have to have been self-inflicted. Also, there's many reports of Lana Clarkson being extremely suicidal and telling people that she was going to end it. But then again, Phil Spector had held people at gunpoint for 20, 30 years at this point. So no one will ever truly know what went down, but the jury and the judge felt that they had enough evidence to convict Phil of murder, to which there was a lot of cheer and there was also a lot of dismay. A lot of Phil's close friends, like Hal Blaine, for example, spoke in his in his favor, and a lot of people said that Phil was misunderstood and that this was a case of everyone thinking that he was a freak and just not paying close enough attention to the forensic details. And what it comes down ultimately, it's kind of the tragic story of Phil Spector, and it's a lesson to be learned from anyone that's a fan of him. It's something that I have tried to definitely absorb, is that if you are violent and if you play with guns for your whole life, and then eventually someone dies at your in your household, let's say, it doesn't matter if you pull the trigger or not. Everyone would already think that he did it, and he, again, very well may have done it. And so he spent the rest of his life in prison. And
Well, he didn't actually go to prison until 2009, right?
yeah, so there was a gap where he pretty much didn't do much at all except for speak at Ike Turner's funeral, maybe a couple other award shows, but he was basically banished from pop culture.
Of all the funerals to speak at, that's a bizarre choice, given the fact that like he did all of that stuff to him with that album, where like he wouldn't let him. What did you say? He wouldn't let him perform on anything that he was producing?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's bizarre. After that, he spoke at his funeral.
Yeah, and he said that Ike was like the best guitarist in the business at the funeral. But it's like a little too late, bro, to be saying that. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the rise and fall of Phil Spector. For as many stories of there are him being negative to people, I think there are a lot of examples of him also being a positive force in people's life. Because I think when you look at the team of people that he assembled, he put them all in a place and gave them the knowledge where they could all succeed on their own. To throw out a few names, we know the musicians like Hal Blaine, Leon Russell, Glenn Campbell. Jack Nitzsche, his arranger, would go on to be a film scorer. His intern was Sonny Bono, and he went on to, of course, be a fabulous producer, and Sonny and Cher show and all that. His songwriters, Barry Mann, Cynthia Well, Carole King, you don't even have to, those names explain all that needs to be said. Jeff Barry would go on to write that Sugar Sugar song for the Archies. Basically what I'm trying to say is, for all the negative, I think he was also a great teacher and coach. And I think a lesson to be taken away with Phil Spector is we can appreciate his innovation, the way that he brought people together and set them on a path for success with their careers. But we can also observe the negative ways he acted in his personal life. And as fans, try to learn from those negative things he did and not repeat them in our own lives, while still trying to empathize with why such a tortured soul may have done those negative things. Basically, if there's anything I hope people can take away from this podcast, is Phil Spector obviously was a flawed human who did a lot of terrible things. But if you really look into the guy and research him, to know him is to love him, and that not everyone is all good or all bad, and that for as much pain as he brought into the world, I think he brought in just as much, and if not more, positivity through his music.
Hmm. I think for me, one of the
Well
things
said.
that gets complicated when you're talking about figures that had such a profound impact, but were also very flawed human beings at the same time, it becomes very complicated because, like you just said, you named all of these different people that were, heavily influenced and did great things as a result of being acquainted with Phil Spector. And I think when you look through anything historically in music, you're always going to find instances of that. And I think, you can observe what happened historically and what came out of it from an objective point of view, regardless of whether or not the person was a good person. There's so many
Yeah,
flawed musicians all throughout music. And, I went to school for jazz, and some of the most
Miles
foundational
Davis.
people in jazz, Miles Davis, like beat women, like they did terrible things. And it's like, you can you can study them while simultaneously acknowledging that they were a terrible person or they did terrible things. They're not like mutually exclusive. And I feel like if you get into this frame of mind where anybody that did anything bad to a certain extent, like you just kind of, cancel them, for lack of a
Yeah,
better term, I guess, like it's, I don't think that's the
it's
most effective
productive.
way to yeah, because their history is not going to go away. They're still a part of. Phil Spector is always going to be the wall of sound producer guy, whether we
Yeah,
like the stuff he did or not.
Mm.
You know.
yeah, and he, as we touched on, it practically single-handedly invented the role um, of a modern producer, and every producer since has him to thank for that. Otherwise, a producer would still just be managing finances and the books, you know, and
Mhm.
maybe twiddling with a few knobs here and there. Um,
Right.
and with Spector, I can say, like, as a producer and as with learning from good and bad, with him, I've learned how to make people work together and how to not give up until I get the sound that I'm going for in my head. But I've also learned I gotta credit and pay my artists properly, and of course, with all the personal mishaps in his life, like, never to repeat those things. I
Mhm.
think with historical figures, even outside of music, it can be in any facet. It's instead of, well, let's just say it, instead of canceling them for their flaws, acknowledging the good and the bad, implementing the good and trying to learn from the bad.
Mhm.
Because every single person in the world, I feel like, would be, canceled if every detail of our life was exposed. Like,
Mhm.
we've all done things we regret. So in the case of Spector, like, Jake Tapper from CNN, like, on Phil Spector's death day, was just posting pictures of Lana Clarkson and said, "This is all I have to say about Phil Spector." And
Mhm.
and with someone like that, and with Spector, it's like, of course he did terrible things, but like we're saying, like, his music will live forever. He gave so much to music that you've got to look at a person as we're all human, and and just learn from each other.
And like I was saying at the beginning of this too, I mean, it's debatable whether or not Pet Sounds would have came out the way it did had Brian not been so heavily influenced by that Phil Spector wall of sound. So I think just another example of how, this massive um, album that was just so groundbreaking that turned so much of us onto the genius of the Beach Boys. Like, who knows if it would have even existed had Phil Spector not done this whole wall. I mean, I'm sure it would have existed, but it might have been in a different form than we know
Right.
it. You know.
I mean, yeah, who even knows if Brian would have had the impetus to push through the surfing sound. It was really the Spector influence that sees the Beach Boys moving away from surf music.
Mm-hmm.
Like, quite literally, when Be My Baby comes out, you start to see them expand, do stuff like Don't Worry Baby and The Warmth of the Sun. as opposed to 409.
409. Yeah, exactly. Well, I definitely look forward to seeing the comment section of this video.
Me too.
This one
I'll
could get interesting.
I'll add that for anyone that wants to explore his catalog, I'll put together a playlist that Mike can put in the comments or in the description, or whatever.
Both. I could do both.
Yeah, cool. Of
What do you have,
Spector's
Spotify?
work. I was planning on doing it on YouTube because that's probably just
better,
most accessible for anyone that's
Yeah.
watching on YouTube anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, one other thing. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous episode, but I heard that Brian chose the name Pet Sounds because it was the initials of Phil Spector. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I've heard that quite often. I've heard two tales. I've heard that that the PS Phil Spector thing, and I've also heard that Mike says that that Brian had ears so good that could pick up things like a dog, and that he started calling Brian Dog Ears, and that kind of eventually morphed into Mike calling the album Pet Sounds. So there's two stories, Of course, Brian and Mike will take credit. Each of those guys would take credit for the name,
of course.
And both of them seem pretty likely that could have gone down. That Mike could have been teasing, and then it sort of turned into this like, oh, that would be a good name. Or the PS thing with Brian's obsession with Spector, equally as likely.
And I had one other question. I jotted this down. I wanted to ask you about this. I read somewhere that his parents, Phil Spector's parents, had the same last name and that they might have been cousins.
Yeah. They were cousins.
Wow.
And Phil Spector had a lot of health problems throughout his life. He eventually would have problems with his throat and would lose his ability to speak. The way his face looked, not like in a making fun of him way, but just in a matter of fact way. The way he would shake, and that started from a pretty young man. He had a lot of health effects because of that.
Did he have Parkinson's?
Well, that's what a lot of people suspect. It probably was that, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It very also could have been a medication side effect, alcohol withdrawal side effect. There's a lot of things, or like we were touching upon, maybe an attribute of the negative health effects when,
inbreeding,
incest happens, or inbreeding, whatever. Yeah, a lot of controversial subjects to tap on with this Phil Spector guy.
Yeah, I was debating on whether or not we should do this episode, but then the more I thought about it, I was like, we might as well. I think, especially having Nate, that was great. That was so educational.
Thank
you. Yes, good job.
I really tried. Hope I wasn't blabbing too much.
No, it was interesting. Learned a lot of stuff.
I like it when you blab. Your blabbing is never a bad thing.
Went down the wrong tube. Thank you, guys. That means a lot. Seriously.
Of course. All right. Well, I guess that is it for this week. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and please let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hopefully.
Sorry, might have to
good.
do the outro.
Oh, right, someone's poisoned Nate's drink already, and it hasn't even been uploaded yet.
I know. Phil Spector, the mind gangster, did.
That's awesome.
Actually, maybe that is a good ending now.
That's a great ending.
Now we brought it all for a circle.
Yeah, it all came full circle. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Really
Thank you. This was a blast.
It was fun. I look forward to the next one. All right, guys.
Take it easy.
See you guys at the next episode. Have a good night, everybody.